Hello, and welcome to It Matters How We Treat One Another, the social psychology show. I'm your host, Matthew David Vasko. If you subscribe to this show on YouTube or your favorite podcasting platform, then thank you. We are grateful for each and every one of our subscribers. This is the final episode of Season 2. Our show will be returning in the fall and will feature an expanded platform. We will be growing to cover all of the social sciences. So, basically, anything having to do with how humans interact, including all of psychology, sociology, political science, economics, and anthropology. We think you're sure to love this expanded platform. This episode features an interview with Professor Matthew Koschmann from the Department of Communication at the University of Colorado, Boulder. Matthew and I will discuss how we can best communicate with others across the current cultural and political divide. But first, our inspiring news. If inspiring things are happening in your neck of the woods, then please send us a direct message on one of our social media accounts and let us know. You can find us by our show name on Facebook, Instagram, X, and Blue Sky. This week's inspiring news comes to us from Amanda from Metamora, Ohio, USA. Amanda works for Ohio Guidestone in Northwest Ohio and shared a news story from WTVG Action News. The news covered how her program that she works with, Ohio Guidestone, has established mental health walk-in centers around the Northwest Ohio area, including in the city of Toledo, Ohio. These walk-in centers are like urgent care centers that a person can go to for their physical health, but these are for your mental health. At the centers, people can connect with a therapist or a psychiatrist and even leave with a prescription for medication. This is indeed inspiring news because the time has come that we all treat our mental health the same as our physical health. Just like we might go to an urgent care center when we're feeling physically ill, we need to learn to seek professional help when we're feeling down, anxious, etc. Remember, the only stigma around mental health should be the stigma of not getting the help we need. Again, if you know of inspiring news happening in your area, then please DM us on our socials and let us know. Thanks. Up next is our feature segment. But first, this show is sponsored by BetterHelp. Some years ago, I was struggling with depression. I knew I was depressed, but I had a hard time asking for help. It seemed like a huge hurdle to figure out how to access therapy services, and the thought of opening up about my depression made me nervous. I eventually did get brave and sought help. Finally, starting therapy was such a relief because knowing I had a professional in my corner helped me start to feel better after even the very first session. Thankfully, BetterHelp is on a mission to make starting therapy easier. Fill out a questionnaire and you will match with a therapist in as little as a couple days. All you need to do is click the link in the description to get started. And BetterHelp is offering fans of this show 10% off your first month of therapy. All you have to do is visit betterhelp.com/itmatters. That's betterhelp.com/itmatters. And now our feature segment. My guest today is Professor Matthew Koschmann. He is an associate professor at the Department of Communication at the University of Colorado, Boulder. His research focuses on organizational communication with an emphasis on the nonprofit sector and civil society. Professor Koschmann is also the editor-in-chief of the academic journal Management Communication Quarterly, and he teaches classes on persuasion, leadership communication, and collaboration. Welcome, Matthew.
Wonderful. Thank you for having me. I appreciate the invitation and looking forward to our conversation.
Excellent, excellent. Me too. This is definitely the kind of thing we need to be talking about these days because, of course, we are experiencing a broad cultural and political divide here in the United States right now. And I'm curious, as a communication scholar, what would you say is the best prescription for these times?
Yeah, I think about that in two ways. One, a more practical level, and one maybe a more conceptual level. And we may want to circle back to the conceptual stuff because one of there are certainly plenty of practical things we can do as we think about different communication skills and practices and so forth. And we'll talk about that here. But a lot of that happens downstream from our assumptions we have about how people change, how people process information, the information environment that we're in, our political economy, all sorts of things. And so there's only so much we can do within a given context. So a big part of my prescription is going upstream a bit and questioning some of the assumptions that we have about what it is we're doing when we interact with other people. But we can probably get to that a little bit later. For now, let's focus on some more of the practical things. I think a big prescription is to, in many ways, have an honest assessment of what is actually going on. I mean, if a doctor is writing you a prescription for a medical condition, we want that prescription, we want that medication to be in line with an accurate diagnosis of the situation. And you're absolutely right that things are incredibly polarized in our society. It seems like there is less and less middle ground, that the rhetoric and the discourse has gotten more and more hostile and hateful. I would push back a little bit, though, on some of those assumptions. I'm not entirely, I mean, of course, at some level, things are very different than they were 10 years ago, 20 years ago, 30 years ago. But in some ways, I don't think a whole lot has changed. I think what is happening in today's environment is aspects of the human condition are being exposed in ways that simply were not possible before. I don't think it's the case that generations ago we were just more civil and more polite. I just think we didn't have as many opportunities to to argue with each other, that there were limitations on how we could engage with each other. If we had all the social media tools, all the technological sophistication that we have now, back during the Vietnam era, back during the civil rights movement, back during women's suffrage, the Civil War, the Revolutionary War, I'm pretty convinced that it would look just as ugly. I think it's the comedian Chris Rock famously said that you're only as faithful as your options. And he was talking about general ethical principles and how people get caught and get in trouble. And that it's not the case that there's these some people who are just bad and other people are, they wouldn't do those things. They wouldn't have that affair. They wouldn't embezzle that money. His point was just, they just don't have the option to do that. And when given the options, humanity demonstrates over and over and over again that we have the capacity to sink to the lowest common denominator. So one part of the prescription is to have an accurate diagnosis of what is going on here. I don't think this is all that new for our broader human condition. I also don't think that something is broken with our system. We often talk about how things aren't working. I actually think polarization and some of the things that you brought up in the intro to your question are features of our system, not bugs, as if it's supposed to work better in this kind of technological or political environment. So that's one thing. I want to start with an accurate diagnosis of our human condition and the context that we're in. And we can get into maybe some of the practical skills to navigate that territory, but then maybe a little bit later we can go a little further upstream and ask about the broader context or the headwaters that give rise to all this in the first place.
Well, I did sort of want to delve more deeply, if you don't mind, into something you touched on there, which is some of the assumptions people make about communication. What are some of those assumptions?
I think if anybody has taken a basic communication class or maybe a communication workshop at work or as part of their primary education or whatever the case may be, you've probably learned something like what we call the transmission model of communication, where communication is this exchange of information between senders and receivers through some kind of channel. It's subject to different kinds of noise. Maybe there's some feedback loop. And the basic idea is to transmit accurate information between the sender and the receiver. We call this the transmission model of communication or an information model. And that's not wrong. I mean, it certainly characterizes a lot of what we do in our day-to-day communication stuff. But I like to think of that as what one of my colleagues used to call a flat earth assumption about communication that doesn't capture the complexities of what's really going on. So what I mean by that is, we know the world is round, right? But we can get by with flat earth assumptions for much of our day-to-day life, going from here to there, looking at the basic geography that's in front of us. Like we don't need to have complicated understandings of the universe and the cosmos to get by with most of our day-to-day life. But if you want to take a transatlantic flight or put a satellite into space, flat Earth assumptions are going to be quite problematic. There's some complexity to the broader universe that needs to be accounted for, and I think that's the case with our communication as well. A lot of us assume what we're doing when we communicate with people can be characterized by this transmission model of communication. That what we're doing is sending and receiving basic information, and that does work for a lot of our day-to-day interaction. However, there are a lot of what we might call round earth complexities that creep into our interactions with people when we communicate with people who have different interests and motivations than us, who have different perspectives and upbringings, when there is a conflict and emotion involved. Just kind of conveying the facts in that situation is rarely adequate to have a good, meaningful interaction and a communication experience. And so, in terms of assumptions, what I, as a communication scholar, want to do is see more people move to what we call a social construction model of communication. And that's a broad, overarching academic approach to human interaction that basically says when we communicate with each other, we're doing so much more than sending and receiving information, although we're doing at least that. But what we are doing is we are literally making our social worlds together. We're not just communicating about stuff, we're actually constituting or making the very things that we're talking about in the interaction, at least in terms of our social realities. I'm not saying it's all perception and the material world doesn't matter, but how we understand what is happening in the material world, that's a matter of social reality. And that's what we're doing when we interact with people. So at the highest level, that's one of the biggest assumptions I would like to maybe challenge or push people to reconsider is what do you think you're doing when you communicate? If it's just a linear exchange of information, we're going to constantly be beating our head against the wall saying, why don't they get it? Why don't they understand? Aren't you listening? Didn't you hear what I said? But that's because that's probably not what's happening. There's some round earth complexities that need to be accounted for by a more sophisticated model of communication that we might call communication as social construction.
Now, how does something like, say, an appeal to emotion fit into that as opposed to logic? Like, which is a better way to approach the conversation? I guess what I'm trying to say is I've often heard it said that when it comes to exploring politics with someone, for example, that it makes a larger impact if you can somehow engage with them emotionally around a topic. Do you feel like that's true, or are you more better off to take a more logical, appeal to reason sort of approach?
Excellent question. And this also relates to maybe challenging some of the conventional wisdom or assumptions we have about our interactions with other people. I'm certainly of the persuasion that it's all emotion and logic and everything else all the time, everywhere, in every interaction. And so the idea that like I mean, anybody who's been involved in a romantic relationship for any period of time knows that probably the worst thing you can say in any conflict is don't be so emotional, or just put your emotions aside. Yeah, that's probably not going to result in any sort of constructive interaction. It's also the case that, well, I just think it's incorrect that you can set emotion aside as if the kind of detached, logical, reasonable, as if that has no emotional content. It does. It's a different kind of emotional content. It's a stoic, detached, disengaged, uh, whatever we might want to call it. But I mean, it is emotional. So the issue isn't whether or not we have emotions, it's how emotions are shaping our interactions with each other. Now, it certainly is the case that we have, physiological reactions in our bodies in response to things that we experience or that we hear other people say or what they do, and managing those feelings in our interaction. And maybe we'll get to that a little bit later with some of the more kind of practical stuff. That very much is a big thing, but it's not, well, let go of your emotions or put your emotions on the side. So in terms of your original question of, effectiveness or what might be better, to me, it's always the channeling of emotions in relation to logic and reasoning, usually in some sort of narrative or story format that tends to be the most compelling and influential. So I think of logic and emotion not so much as like the tip of the spear, but rather the barb on the fish hook. It's not the thing you want to attack with, but it's likely the thing that might kind of keep people hooked. But what draws them to your ideas isn't the hook. It's the fly or the bait or whatever shiny, attractive thing that wants to be engaged with. And then if there is a logical or reasonable or rational underpinning to those ideas, that can often make them more persuasive and stick or hook a little bit better.
Got it. Got it. Speaking of emotion, I think tempers can flare in conversations about politics or
Absolutely.
issues along that line. What do you recommend to people to help them stay calm and respectful?
So a couple different things. One, this goes to some of the more upstream things that as a scholar I tend to focus more on. How did we get here, and what's the context and what's going on here? Again, I don't think it's the case that there is a viable solution to every situation.
Mm,
And that I'm not suggesting that was behind your inquiry here, but that is often the assumption you hear is like, well, how do I talk with my family members like this? How do I interact with my romantic partner in this way? How do I talk to people? And sometimes the answer is, I don't know that you can.
mm,
In that context, in that situation, I'm not sure that those things are all compatible, and that there is and again, this goes back to the transmission model assumption, as if there's always some kind of informational mathematical solution that if I just put these nouns and verbs together in this way, that'll solve the problem. And I just don't think that's the case. Now, so what that means then is, one, being very careful about the kinds of situations you get yourself into in the first place. Some of us, we look for trouble. We want to agitate and provoke, and I'm not sure that's a great idea. But if that's what you want to do, good luck with that. I think others of us in many situations may just need to relinquish control or exit certain situations. Just say there's nothing to
mm,
gain here. So it's not a matter of like, how do I do this well? It's a matter of starting by saying there is no way to do this well. I can't talk to that person in this context about those ideas in that manner and expect any kind of constructive outcome. Now, that you can't control all the situations you're in. So one, I think, practical, so, I mean, not solution, but practice would be, the recovery community has some wonder. I mean, they're all about daily, hourly, practical skills you can put into use when confronted with all sorts of challenges.
mm.
The acronym HALT is often brought up. It just, when you feel that physiological reaction, when you feel your blood start to boil a little bit, when you feel the lure of being tempted to something that you don't want to engage in or that you know is not good for you, halt. And that
Mhm.
stands for, am I hungry, angry, lonely, tired?
Mm.
If I can just take a breath and say, you know what, I just need something to eat. Right?
Mhm.
Let's talk about this later. I'm angry about something else. I mean,
Okay.
that's a great practice in romantic relationships or other interpersonal communication. Hey, I'm upset right now. It's not about you, but I can't have a good conversation about this right now. Maybe there's a lack of connection, or maybe you're just tired. And so, having an awareness of what is going on with you physiologically and how you're responding to some of these situations, and having the capacity to attribute those feelings to something outside of the interaction or the person you're talking to and say, I'm gonna attribute my feelings to that, not to you. Because if I attribute them to you, then I need to win and conquer and be right and whatever else. So I think if we can have a good sense of what situations I should even be in the first place, and then when we find ourselves in some of those inevitable situations, if we can just halt and
Mm.
be responsive to the physiology of our body and make different attributions, I think that can diffuse some of those tensions.
That reminds me of the practice of mindfulness,
Yes,
right?
absolutely.
Like taking that internal assessment, right? Sort of mentally stepping back from the situation and saying, what am I feeling right now? What's going on with me? What's going on with my body? What's going on with me emotionally, right? Tuning into yourself so that you feel more grounded, right? More stable.
Yeah,
In,
absolutely.
in terms of communication, are there any communication skills that people can use to help them find common ground with those on
Yeah,
the
yeah.
opposite side of the cultural and political divide?
The good news is there are a lot of things we can do.
Okay.
The challenge, of course, is it requires certain kinds of contexts and situational factors to already be in place.
Mm.
But the good news there is we can work to shape context and create situations. Maybe we can get into that a little bit later. But if we're in a situation where it's like, okay, I think the parameters here are pretty good. I'm talking with somebody who's at least respecting what I have to say. We have adequate time. Uh, we understand some of the basic assumptions that each other's bringing to the table. So in the persuasion research literature, there's all kinds of studies about why people choose what they choose and what influences them to change their mind, things like that. And there are some basic principles here. I'm relying on the research of Robert Cialdini he's a retired professor from University of Arizona and has wrote a landmark book years ago called Influence that and his research has just continued to pile up all these basic principles of effective persuasion, and there are some that we can put into practice in a lot of different situations. One is just the principle of liking. People do not agree with things they don't like, and that's one of the fascinating but often frustrating aspects of the social world and our interactions with other people. People are allowed to believe bad ideas, and they are not required to agree with good ideas. um,
Right.
it's not like in your physics class where it doesn't matter what you think about gravity, it will affect you. I can have a great argument for something, and someone can just say, "No, I don't." Usually, it's because they don't like something about me, about what it would mean to agree with that idea. So there's a general likability that's got to be in place if we want to be influential. It is rarely the case, maybe sometimes, but rarely the case that people say, you know what? I really don't like that person, but doggone it, they're right. I've got to agree with them. I think it's more likely to say, you know what? I don't agree with that person. And but there's something about them I like and I
Mm.
want to hear more. So liking's a big one. Reciprocity is another key principle. Responding to people in the way that they interact with you. There are lots of things we can do to reciprocate. We can demonstrate the kinds of things that people are demonstrating to us. We can ask to read the things that they read, watch the videos that they watch. Ask them, hey, so I'd love to learn more about that perspective. What are some of the books you've read or websites you go to that have shaped your thinking? I'd love to just kind of learn more about that.
Mm.
There's a wonderful theoretical, practical perspective across not just our discipline of communication, but other social scientific disciplines called appreciative inquiry. It's a way of engaging with people, both in terms of inquiring versus arguing, but doing that from a position of appreciation. That's something that we can practice, a genuine curiosity and a desire to understand and learn. All those things together create a context where people feel heard, respected, valued, maybe willing to let their guard down a little bit, maybe willing to consider your ideas a bit more. But there's the good news is there's lots of things we can put into practice when we're in that situation that seems fairly constructive to have a good conversation.
What is the role of argumentation and reasoning? Like, is there a time when it's really worth getting in there and duking it out?
Yes, but a very qualified yes.
Mm,
Think about some of the situations where we see argumentation working well and held to an ideal in our society. Probably the courtroom would be one of the main places. But just think of how many structural, contextual, situational factors have to be in place for that mode of engagement to work well. There are very strict rules about who is even allowed to engage in the conversation, what you're allowed to say when you're in the conversation, what can or cannot be struck from the record, who is or is not allowed to hear certain things. Instructions are given to juries about how they are supposed to deliberate and what they can and cannot pay attention to and what they can and cannot make decisions about. So the problem though is that when we get outside of the courtroom, we still want to argue, we still want to have those debates, but we have none of those parameters. There
mm,
are no restrictions on what can be said and who can say stuff and what you can and cannot deliberate on and what you're allowed to hear. So we need to be incredibly careful. So I think of argumentation, logic, reasoning, stuff like that. I mean, it's fire. It can heat your house or burn it down. It's really how we use it. It's
mhm.
incredibly powerful. And if you can supplement a compelling story, an emotional narrative with some good reasons, with some logical connections between things, that can really round out a compelling conversation. But if it's just argument and just reasoning, oftentimes that can be putting off to people because most of the time, and I'm as guilty as anybody, but most of us, most of the time, when we are confronted by arguments and examples that contradict or refute our position, most of us do not say, you know what? You're right. Most of us dig in and we hold to it. It's called the boomerang effect in many that in many ways those arguments just they come right back around and we actually become even more secure in our position and more against the other position. So it's not the case that logic and reasoning just work like an algorithm or a mathematic or scientific formula that if you just, well, look, I've laid it all out here. The answer is clearly this, and you need to agree with it whether you like it or not. That is not how things work in most of our social world. People are allowed to disagree with good ideas, and they are allowed to believe irrational bad ideas. So that to me is knowing those things helps us be a little more nuanced in how we utilize the fire of logic, argumentation, and reasoning.
I so want to quote you on that that about how people are allowed to believe illogical, poorly reasoned perspectives,
Well, I'm
because
sure I've
I'm
just
up
picked it up
against
from
that.
somebody else myself, but it certainly has been a truism that I have found and has really shaped my in many ways conversion or evolution to much more of a social constructionist approach because you realize something else is going on here because the facts are all here, the argument is airtight, the logic is sound, and they still don't agree with me. That means there's more going on than just the
Mm.
basic transmission of facts and information through a logical structure.
I have heard it said that you could at that point pause and say to someone, what would it take to change your mind on
Right.
this issue?
Well,
to
and
try to
that,
gain a little more insight into where exactly they are, right? Or where they're coming from.
right, right. Totally agree. However, my anecdotal experience would be, depending upon the issue, though, most people's response is nothing. Nothing would change my mind. And
Uh,
that has to do with because of the emotional, the ideological valence we place on so many of these ideas, the identity connections we have. I mean, it may sound silly, but I mean, if you were to say to me, well, what would it take? What argument would convince you that, your wife doesn't love you, that this isn't the person you're supposed to marry, that you really shouldn't put your children first in your family, or something like that? I'd say it doesn't matter. You can give me all the evidence. Yeah, but she said this one time, or your kid did that one time. It doesn't matter. I'm never gonna not love my wife and children. There's nothing you can say. Now, that's an extreme example, but there are a lot of issues in our political discourse or our pop culture or other modes of engagement and things that we care about that kind of fall more into that category. There are positions people have. There is nothing that will change their mind.
mhm.
And we're all probably guilty of that in some way, shape, or form.
Right. I once, had somebody they were talking about I was attending a lecture and they were talking about trying to change people's minds on things, and they used the argument, well, I like who I am and I like what I think, and I don't plan on changing my mind on
Right.
everything.
Right.
So why should I expect anyone else to?
Well, sure. I mean, think about it like this, and this gets to some more of the upstream issues. If we go a little further and talk about like, yeah, but where is this coming from, and what are the headwaters that feed our interactions with other people? I mean, think about this idea of changing your mind or changing people's minds. I would invite you or anybody watching the presentation here, think about a time when you have actually changed your mind on something of substance. Not learn about something for the first time and be like, oh yeah, that's interesting. I now believe that. I mean, and not something trivial on, ice cream flavor or whatever else. I mean something that you had a fairly defined position on. Maybe it was politics, the economy, relationships, whatever. And you now hold a different position on that. I don't know what those things are, but I have a hunch. I know a few characteristics. One, I think that list is very short. Two, I think the process by which that change happened probably took place over a long period of time and not a linear process. Lots of back and forth of trying this, considering that, whatever. I bet that there were some important people involved, some relationships that shaped that. And I bet it's likely the case that it wasn't some airtight argument where you're like, all right, I give in. That's the answer. I'm changing my mind. I bet it was a slow progression of just you kind of woke up one day and you're like, you know what? I think I'm over here now.
Hmm.
So if you believe me on those characteristics of what actually happens when people change their minds, I think that will shape what we think we're doing when we're interacting with people, realizing we are almost certainly not going to change their minds unless we're talking about basic facts. And even that is questionable these days. At best, you will play a small role in a large process, a process that you don't know the half of, and you have no idea how your comments or your disposition is connecting to other people's experiences. And somehow you will be one small Jenga piece in the construction of that tower that eventually may lead to a mind change that you are likely to never witness or experience. If that's what you believe about how people change, I don't know exactly what it means for what you'll say, but I bet you will interact with people a lot differently.
That is so interesting that you say that because I've heard that said in different ways over the years
Yeah,
that it's worth having the conversation with people because they often will remember something you said weeks, months, years
right,
before. when it finally comes time for them to change their mind on an issue.
And they'll probably remember it differently than you did. I can't, I'm old enough now where I've interacted with enough students or connected with enough people that people talk about experiences we've had and how they've influenced them. And when I hear friends tell stories about this thing we did, or I hear students talk about this thing you said in class, I can't tell you how many times I'm like, I don't think I said that, or boy, I don't remember it that way. And
Right.
then you realize, again, going back to the social construction model, oh, it's not just this collection of objective facts that add up to the truth. It's all these experiences and perceptions and interests and emotions and motivations in this complicated stew that we might call your beliefs and values that are subject to evolve and change and move around. And we don't really know how it all goes together. We just know that it does and that people play a role in it somehow.
Yeah. You brought up the item of respect
Mm.
earlier, and I was curious, what can we do when we're in a conversation with someone and we don't feel like our views are being respected?
Well, honestly, I would walk away. I mean,
Mm,
I think that's, again, that speaks to this issue of like treating communication and interaction as like a math problem that has an objective right answer. That it's like, oh, if I could just figure it out, I could just solve this puzzle and say the right combinations of nouns and verbs, then I'll have that mic drop moment where I just dazzle them with my logic or I totally refute their perspective. As you probably have picked up by now, I just don't think that's the case, at least
mhm,
not very often. So things like respect, contempt, I mean, those are the things we should start to get good at noticing and realizing, oh, okay, there's a fatal flaw in our engagement here. When there is disrespect, when there is contempt and disregard, nothing good is going to happen. So I think in one level, there's a recognition that there's nothing to gain here. There's nothing to accomplish in this interaction. Now, that doesn't mean we can't lean into that a little bit, or sometimes we can't avoid those interactions. But in that regard, as difficult as it may be, often the best thing is to name stuff and just say, I get the impression that you don't even respect this perspective, that it just
mhm.
has no, do you think it has any merit? And the answer may be no. And then we can say, okay, well, I just wanted to clarify, at least we know where we're at. And I have had those kinds of conversations where it's just like, okay, you're here and I'm here. And at least right now, there's really nothing to resolve that difference. So let's just call it what it is and maybe move on to something else. And a big part of it is just this goes back to some of the assumptions and things we were talking about previously. I mean, once you let go of the idea that like I can change your mind, at least in one interaction or a great debate or something like that, and I kind of have a duty to or responsibility to, like it's kind of on my watch that your bad ideas are happening, and I need to. Once you let go of all that and begin to appreciate people for their inherent humanity and just the soul that they are, and what can be gained from the interaction, it's just such a better experience. And yes, it's not direct. You don't know where that might take you, but I can assure you the outcomes are usually so much better.
I think you may have just answered my next question,
Okay.
which is what should be our goal when we go into these conversations with people?
Oh, great question. I think we can have multiple goals. It is not the case that some situations don't call for debate and argumentation and reasoning. I want us to pay close attention to the contextual factors that may or may not call for that mode of engagement and what parameters might be in place to ensure healthy engagement. So we talked about the courtroom. Probably the opposite end of the spectrum might be the anonymous comment section in an online forum. That's probably the exact opposite of the courtroom where it's anything goes. So recognizing like what are the parameters of the communication environment in the first place and what modes of engagement are called for. And that we can have multiple goals. It's not the case that you go into some professional meeting at work and let's just hold hands and sing kumbaya and just appreciate each other and never get anything done. That is not what I, or I hope anyone else in my field, is saying. There are contexts that call for different kinds of modes of engagement. What I am saying, though, it's rarely the case that our interpersonal, family, relational stuff that exists outside from professional contexts or some task-oriented endeavor, that those call for winning debates, impressing people with your logic and reasoning. In that regard, personally, I think the main goal has to do with our humanity, connection, understanding, appreciation, curiosity, learning. Those are the kinds of things I would want to be on the forefront when we think about why are we having this conversation in the first place?
It was funny. It kind of made me laugh what you said about winning because nothing makes me lose an argument with one of my siblings faster than winning.
Yep,
You know what I mean? Like
absolutely.
scoring that real zinger just wow, makes them storm off in a huff and then they don't want to talk to me anymore, you
Now
know.
you can win in the worst sort of way, and we experience that with our relationships so many times, where it's like, okay, I think I won, but boy, it does not feel like it. And then there's other times where it's like, wow, I'm pretty sure I lost the debate part of that interaction, but somehow we're good, we're better. And
Mhm.
so I think it's having just a more nuanced and accurate diagnosis of the situation and the place of debate, argument, and reasoning and logical discourse.
Very good. And then finally, I wanted to ask maybe there might be one other follow-up question
Sure, yeah. What
after
do you
that,
got?
but there's a lot of hatred out there in the world right now. We're seeing, it seems like a lot of hatred. People are talking hate. I don't know why.
Yeah.
But do you have any tips for communicating with people who are speaking hate?
Well, I'll go back to something I said before of just walk away. Like I
Mm.
don't know that some of those contexts I'm not sure are redeemable in a particular moment, in a particular interaction. I think there's a lot of great ancient wisdom out there. I think of the Judeo-Christian scriptures. There's proverbs that talk about, don't answer a fool according to their folly, or you yourself will become like them. But then the same proverb also says you should answer a fool according to their folly, lest they become wise in their own eyes. And so there's this tension about how we engage with the fool, or maybe we could put the hater in that category. And I think you can round this out with some more wisdom from those same scriptures later. Jesus talks about being wise as serpents and innocent as doves. And I think those go together quite nicely of kind of reading the room of like, okay, I need to be shrewd here. And there may be a situation where hatred needs to be responded to according to its own folly. I think there are some important parameters that probably need to be in place for that to go well. And when those parameters are not there, it may be the case to not respond to a hater or a fool according to their hatred or folly, lest we become like them.
Yeah, that's one thing I've heard before is you wouldn't want to have somebody with a hateful perspective score any points on you. Uh, you're better off to just sort of say something positive
Yeah.
or state your case and get out of there.
Well,
As
right. And
opposed to
again, I think this
drawing
speaks
them
to
in.
our assumptions about what is going on. And again, once we let go of the idea that hateful interaction, that like there's something at stake here that needs to be fixed and resolved and responded to, as if I could just come up with the perfect mic drop saying like I will end the hate and put them in their place. Once we let go of that, because that is rarely the case, and
Oh,
we relinquish this compulsion that like I've got to say something. Somebody was wrong out there on the internet somewhere. I can just sense it, and I my statement will fix it.
Mm,
Once you realize, no, that's very likely not going to happen, that there is always a rebuttal to what, however crazy it is, you will never, ever get the last word in that kind of an interaction.
mm.
It will just perpetuate, it will never be resolved. Once you let go of the idea that I've got to do something here, I think we can navigate those spaces much more constructively.
How do you mean? I mean, y- we should probably though push back against hate, right?
Yeah, boy, this is the million-dollar question, right? Because this is that tension of the proverb. On the one hand, don't answer the fool because you're wasting your time and it's going to hurt you. On the other hand, sometimes fools their folly needs to be responded to. I don't have a great answer for, I mean, there's no algorithm that solves that tension. That is a deeper intrinsic part of our fallen humanity in many ways. And wisdom comes from learning how to navigate those spaces. I would say there's probably some contextual factors that call for those kinds of responses. For example, I'm in the classroom as a professor and something is said that likely could be harmful or offensive. We may want to engage in that moment. And I probably have a responsibility to respond in some wise way. Or if we're in a professional meeting, or if we're in a close group of friends. So it's more about reading the context and understanding, being wise about, you know what, this requires a response versus the online comments, the the big protest rally where somebody says something somebody doesn't agree with, or whatever the case may be. That I think the wisdom there, the wisdom of the serpent of being a little shrewd is saying there's nothing to gain here. I'm not responsible for this. This isn't going to change anything. This is now about me and needing to sound off than it is about any sort of constructive resolution. But
Gotcha.
I absolutely grant, I mean, you've got your finger on probably one of the key issues is navigating the tension between being shrewd like the serpent, being innocent like the dove, responding to the fool versus not responding to the fool. There's no easy answer, but wisdom comes from learning how to navigate those experiences through lots of practice and experience.
Excellent. Excellent. I did want to circle back to one thing you brought up early in our conversation,
Yeah, sure.
and that was you said we would probably circle back later to the idea of the structures and institutions that shape our interactions with each other. Could you talk about that a little bit?
Absolutely. This is a big part of how we think about things as communication scholars, is that there's really no neutral territory. It's not just the world just kind of exists out there that and it has no bearing on our interactions with each other. And we just have to assemble the right nouns and verbs and adjectives that solve the problem for whatever we're trying to accomplish in our interactions with each other. Instead, it's the case that there are always these hidden forces, if you will, that are kind of lurking and present in our interactions with each other. I mean, just think about having an interaction with your boss at work. Even if they say, "Oh, you can be honest with me. Just tell me what you're thinking." That the power dynamic and the hierarchical difference is present in that interaction. I mean, it's not tangible. I mean, physical or material, at least not in a conventional sense, but it is there. And to say that that's not influencing the interaction, I think in many ways is just naive. So we can think about other factors. We know a lot about our social media and technological environment, the attention economy, and how it's incentivizes outrage and it's motivated by engagement, not necessarily truth. So we can see those things coming to bear, the way things are prioritized in our social media feeds, what shows up on cable news. I think that's pretty well established that that's an environment that shapes, it rewards certain modes of engagement and it punishes or just silences. I mean, certain modes of engagement just don't show up in our public sphere. That's one of them. Another one has to do with how we think about what's going on in our society and how we interact with each other. So I mentioned before that I don't think people of a bygone era were necessarily more civil or polite. I just think they didn't have the tools to be as nasty as we are today. And if they did, we might see more similarities. We also have some, I think, unhelpful assumptions about what is going on in our society. So you'll often hear things like, we all really kind of value the same things. We just disagree on how to get there. I I don't think that's a helpful assumption. I think we actually don't agree. And where we agree, it's on such a high level of abstraction to be fairly meaningless. We may all agree on dignity and justice, but if your operationalization of that is pro-life and someone else's is pro-choice, you don't agree on the same thing. You see justice and dignity differently. We also hear people say things like, well, most people aren't on the extremes. They're in the middle. They're moderate. Yes and no. I mean, the middle is a statistical artifact. It is not the case that people in the middle believe the same things. They're just muddled in there. And one of the fascinating things that has come out in a lot of this kind of research is this notion of compromise. CNN had an article on this online several years ago that showed that although people are tired of all the political partisanship and hatred, they want leaders to compromise. They want people in their neighborhoods to just compromise and agree. What they really mean is, I want other people to change their minds. Most people
Right.
don't want to compromise. What they mean is, I want other people to tone down a little bit. I want those extremists over there to moderate their position. And research continues to show when you push so-called moderates on stuff, they can be just as polarized as long as you find their issue.
Hmm,
So,
interesting.
what I'm getting at is the structure, the discourse of our national conversations, the way we interact with each other, those unhelpful assumptions, I think, take us down some places that are, well, it gives us a false sense of optimism that, oh, you and I, we basically agree. We just kind of, we differ on some of the details. So let's just move the tax rate a little percentage. No, I think it's actually a lot worse than maybe we are willing to let on. But I think if we can be honest about that, we can have a more accurate diagnosis and hopefully the prescription can be more effective.
I hope I have been having this thought lately. I hope that if nothing else is happening right now with how polarized everything is, I hope at the very least people are being open about their perspectives,
Yeah.
right? Because I feel like that's what's happened more than anything else, is
Right.
that people have started to speak their minds more. I don't
Yes.
know that their views have changed. They're just
Yeah.
talking about it more. But the
I
good thing
agree.
about talking is that you can air issues out. You can debate it. You can, try to do some of these things we've been talking about in this conversation today. When people won't share their perspective, that I don't see how that's constructive either.
I think you're absolutely right about that. And I think one way, I mean, it's very difficult to define and understand an era when you're in it. We define them looking back, and it's for
Yeah.
scholars and historians of the future to look back on our era. But I have a hunch that one of the ways to think about our era, I don't know, let's just say that since the beginning of the 2000s till we are now, is an era of reckoning. I think in many ways we are slowly and often painfully coming to terms with things that already were there.
Mm.
That these things, it may be new that they're part of our public discourse, but that's because we have so many more channels and media for those ideas to be brought into public. But think of any of the hot button controversial issues that define our politics, and I don't even need to name them. I'm sure we can all come up with our own list. It's tempting to say, well, when I was a kid, nobody blah 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 blah, or that's not how we. I don't know. I think a lot of that stuff was there and we just didn't know about it. And what we're coming to realize is, oh, those kind of people exist and have
Right.
been here for a while. People have always believed those kinds of ideas. They just haven't bubbled up to popular discourse. And so I think what we're coming to is a reckoning of like, oh, this is who we are. And it's
Mhm.
probably going to take generations to sort out how we do democracy, if our democracy survives, with this pluralistic, multi-racial, generational, ideological citizenry that we have.
Mm. Interesting. That's probably a good place to stop.
Sure,
Leave it on that thought. Leave it up, leave it to history.
indeed.
I definitely want to do the feel good five if you've
Oh
got a few
yeah,
more
let's do
minutes.
it.
And see what kind of inspiration we can share here.
Absolutely. No,
So
good,
the
good to end
feel
on some feel good vibes here.
There you go. There you go. The Feel Good Five is five rapid fire questions to get some uplift at the end of our interview with our guests. Are you ready?
Let's do it.
Here we go. What is your favorite feel good song?
Feel good song. Oh, there's a group. I only know two of their songs. A group called Walk the Moon. They've got a song that "Shut Up and Dance with Me" and another song "One Foot in Front of the Other." I don't know. I feel like I always hear those songs at parties or weddings or some kind of feel good moment, and I just have such a great positive affinity when those songs are on, and I often they're kind of part of my workout playlist if I'm running with the dogs or something like that. I don't know. I find it quite uplifting. I don't have to think too much about it, and it takes me back to some good experiences.
Wonderful. What is your favorite feel good movie or TV show?
Oh, I'd have to say, more recently, Ted Lasso. I think that was just a perfect storm, if you will, of the right message at the right time. During COVID, people were streaming and watching, and things were getting tense, and just the positivity, the constructive interactions and mentorship that show exhibited. I don't know. There's just something good about it, and I always just walked away feeling better about myself when my wife and I were watching that together.
Excellent. What helps lift you up when you're feeling down?
Well, certainly our dogs. There's something about. I mean, if anybody's a dog owner out there, we've got two dogs. We've got a Lab Boxer mix and an Alaska Malamute. They couldn't be too different, but they are just peas in a pod, always playing with each other and with us. And there's something about just the unfettered companionship and loyalty of a dog that just, no matter how bad you're feeling, can certainly always lift me up.
Wonderful. What gives your life meaning?
Oh, well, I hinted at a little of this in some of my answers, quoting or paraphrasing things from the Judeo-Christian scriptures. I'm a practicing Christian. I know that comes with a lot of baggage these days, and well, what kind of Christian, and what does that mean, and how does that shape your politics? That's a bigger conversation for another day. If anything, I generally don't like to get into that. I see myself as a red letter Christian, as they used to say, a follower of Jesus, and inspired by the words of the Sermon on the Mount. And so I just understand so much of what I do, who I am, how I engage with other people as through the lens of a follower of Jesus.
Wonderful. And what inspires you?
What inspires me? I would say excellence, especially like real time excellence. Part of that is because I've been pretty mediocre and practicing mediocrity in so many areas of my life. Just that perpetual B plus student. Um, the guy on the basketball team who came off the bench. But there's something about people who achieve a certain level of excellence that is just I find very inspiring. And when I say real time, so much of our society is manufactured and edited and constructed and computer generated or whatever. That some of the few places are like live sports, like when somebody comes through in the moment, or even things that we experience in our day-to-day lives, whether it's I don't know, someone's speech at a retirement party, or something you did in the classroom on that one day where that's never going to happen again. A graduation ceremony. Our oldest son just graduated from high school. Um, some of those things that it's like this only happens one time, right now, in person, and they came through. they
Nice.
did it. They excelled in the moment. I find that incredibly inspiring.
Beautiful. Yeah, that is really fantastic. Well, thank you so much. It's been an absolute pleasure, Matthew. Thanks so much for being on the show. Thanks for all your insights into how we can try to bridge this divide that we have going on in our nation right now. I wish you the very best.
Well, same to you. Thank you for having me. I appreciate the invitation and really wish you all the best in this broader project because we certainly need more of this in our society. So thank you for what you're doing and thanks for having me along.
This brings us to the end of this episode of It Matters How We Treat One Another. Thank you to our guest, Professor Matthew Koschmann from University of Colorado, Boulder. Learn more at colorado.edu/CMCI. Please subscribe to keep up with all our episodes, and you can support the show on Patreon at patreon.com/itmatterspatrons or by shopping our Etsy store at etsy.com/shop/itmattersmerch. There are links in the description. Your quote of the week is, quote, "We will not agree on every issue, but let us respect those differences and respect one another." That is from former New Hampshire Governor John Lynch. And remember, treat everyone with kindness, respect, empathy, and compassion, and try for love and acceptance whenever possible. Be well, and much love to you all.